People like to imagine that betrayal feels like a blade, sharp, sudden, and catastrophic. They expect shock, rage, and heartbreak. I felt none of those things. What I felt was clarity, a narrowing of focus, a quiet, precise understanding of what needed to happen next. Oxford's Sheldonian Theatre was warm that afternoon, the kind of heat that clings to your skin and makes the air feel heavy. Parents fanned themselves with programs, graduates shifted in their gowns, and the vice-chancellor recited ceremonial Latin with the weary cadence of a man who had done this too many times. My son Daniel sat among the graduates, his posture straight, his expression composed. He has always been like that, observant, self-contained, a mirror of my own temperament. I should have been thinking about him, about the years that led to this moment. Instead, I was thinking about my husband. Alistair arrived late, sliding into the seat beside me with the casual arrogance of a man who believes the world will wait for him. His suit was immaculate, his cufflinks gleaming, and his hair styled with the precision of someone who pays others to think about such things. He smelled of bergamot and cedarwood, his usual cologne, but beneath it lingered something floral, something that did not belong to him. I noticed immediately. I always notice things. He leaned in, kissed my cheek, and whispered, "Traffic was hell." His lips were warm, his lie was cold. I didn't respond. I simply watched him settle into his seat, watched him adjust his tie, and watched his eyes drift across the hall with restless anticipation. He wasn't looking at the stage. He wasn't looking at Daniel. He was looking for someone. I followed his gaze. She sat 3 rows behind us, partially obscured by a column. Young, blonde, wearing a pale blue dress that stood out against the sea of dark academic robes. She wasn't watching the ceremony, she was watching him, and he was watching her. The exchange was subtle, too subtle for most. A brief meeting of eyes, a small private smile, a tilt of the head that suggested familiarity, intimacy, possession. I felt nothing, not anger, not jealousy, not even surprised. Only confirmation I had suspected for months. The late nights, the sudden trips, the unexplained withdrawals. The way he spoke to me was with the polite detachment one reserves for a colleague rather than a wife. But suspicion is not evidence, and evidence is what I needed. The ceremony continued. Names were called. Applause rose and fell like waves. When Daniel's name echoed through the hall, I clapped with the same measured enthusiasm as everyone else. Alistair clapped too, but his eyes drifted back to the blonde woman before the applause had even faded. I watched him. I watched her. I watched the invisible thread between them tighten and slacken with each stolen glance. By the time the ceremony ended, my decision was made. Outside, the courtyard buzzed with families taking photographs. Daniel found us quickly, his face bright with accomplishment. I hugged him, congratulated him, and told him how proud I was. Every word was true. He deserved this moment. Alistair hugged him too, though his eyes kept flicking over Daniel's shoulder, scanning the crowd and searching for her. She appeared near the edge of the courtyard, pretending to admire the architecture. She was terrible at pretending. Her gaze kept drifting toward us, toward him. Alistair excused himself under the pretext of taking a call. I watched him walk toward her, watched the way his shoulders relaxed, and watched the way her face lit up when he approached. They spoke in low voices, too low for anyone else to hear. But I didn't need to hear the words. Their bodies said enough. They slightly leaned toward each other, the way she touched his arm, the way he didn't pull away. I took a photograph, not one of them, of Daniel smiling in his gown, but in the background, blurred but unmistakable, were the 2 of them. Close, familiar, incriminating, a useful image, not for confrontation, for documentation. Confrontation is emotional, documentation is strategic. When Alistair returned, he was smiling, a real smile, not the polished one he used for investors and journalists. He looked lighter, freer, as if he had stepped briefly into a life where he wasn't required to pretend. "Shall we go for lunch?" he asked. I nodded. "Of course." We walked to the restaurant he had booked, a place with white tablecloths and discreet staff, the kind of establishment where wealthy men conduct affairs and assume no one will notice. Daniel talked about his plans, his future, and his excitement. I listened. Alistair pretended to listen. The blonde woman walked past the restaurant window once, twice, 3 times. Each time she glanced inside. Each time Alistair shifted in his seat. He was careless. That was useful. After lunch, Daniel left to celebrate with his friends. Alistair suggested we return to London early. I agreed. There was no reason to stay. The drive was quiet. He scrolled through his phone, smiling at messages he tried to hide. I watched the countryside blur past the window, my mind already assembling the framework of what needed to be done. A disappearance is not a single act. It is a sequence, a choreography, a narrative constructed with precision. By the time we reached our townhouse in Kensington, I had outlined the first phase of the plan. Not on paper, not on my phone, in my mind. A place he could not access. He poured himself a drink. I declined one. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was tired. He accepted the explanation without question. He always accepted the explanations that made his life easier. That night, he fell asleep quickly. I watched him for a moment, studying the man I had married, the man who had once been charming, ambitious, and magnetic, the man who had become careless, entitled, and predictable. Predictability is a weakness, one I intended to exploit. I went to my study, closed the door, and began the real work. I opened my laptop. I accessed accounts he didn't know I monitored. I reviewed documents he assumed I never looked at. I traced patterns he believed were invisible. Every marriage has a story. Ours had reached its final chapter. But endings are not collapses. Sometimes they are constructions, designs, architectures of consequence. I was not going to confront him. I was not going to argue. I was not going to plead. I was going to disappear. And when I did, the world would look at him, not me. They would ask questions. They would find inconsistencies. They would uncover secrets. They would follow the trail I left behind, and every step of that trail would lead to him. Not because he was guilty of my disappearance, but because he was guilty of everything else. I closed the laptop. The plan had begun.